On July 20, 1944, a group of German military officers attempted to assassinate Adolf Hitler at his military headquarters in East Prussia. The attempt failed, and the subsequent investigation resulted in approximately 5,000 arrests and several hundred executions over the following 10 months. This account is based on documented historical records, witness testimony, court transcripts, and post-war investigations. Colonel Klaus Schenk Graf von Stauffenberg, born November 15, 1907 in Jettingen, Bavaria, came from an aristocratic Catholic family with a long tradition of military service. He joined the Reichswehr in 1926 and pursued a career as a cavalry officer. By 1943, he held the rank of lieutenant colonel and was serving with the 10th Panzer Division in North Africa. On April 7, 1943, his vehicle was strafed by Allied aircraft near Mezzouna in Tunisia. The attack cost him his right hand, the fourth and fifth fingers of his left hand, and his left eye. He also suffered injuries to his left ear and right knee. During his recovery at a Munich hospital, Stauffenberg came into contact with members of the German resistance. His injuries did not end his military career. By September 1943, he was appointed Chief of Staff to General Friedrich Olbricht at the General Army Office in Berlin. In this position, he had access to the Führer and could attend military conferences. Stauffenberg became the operational leader of the conspiracy to kill the Nazi leader, replacing earlier conspirators who had either lost access or lacked the will to act. The conspiracy to remove Hitler had been developing since at least 1938. General Ludwig Beck, who served as Chief of the General Staff from 1935 to 1938, opposed the Führer's plans for war and resigned his position in August 1938. Beck became a central figure in the military resistance, working with others who believed the dictator's leadership would lead to Germany's destruction. Early resistance members included Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, head of the Abwehr Military Intelligence Service, and his deputy Colonel Hans Oster. These men used their positions to protect resistance members and gather intelligence useful to the conspiracy. Several assassination attempts preceded July 20th. In March 1943, officers serving with Army Group Center on the Eastern Front attempted to kill the German leader during a visit to Smolensk. Major General Henning von Treschow and Lieutenant Fabian von Schlabrendorf placed a bomb disguised as a package of brandy bottles aboard the Führer's aircraft. The bomb failed to detonate due to a faulty detonator. A week later, Colonel Rudolf Christoph Freiherr von Gersdorf volunteered to detonate explosives on his person during a visit to an exhibition in Berlin. The Nazi leader left the exhibition earlier than scheduled, and Gersdorf was unable to position himself close enough before departure. Stauffenberg himself had previously carried explosives to meetings, but circumstances prevented him from executing the attack. On July 11, 1944, Stauffenberg attended a conference at the Berghof in Bavaria, carrying a bomb but decided not to detonate it because Heinrich Himmler was not present. The conspirators wanted to eliminate both the Führer and Himmler simultaneously. On July 15th, Stauffenberg again brought explosives to a conference at the Wolfschanze, but again did not act, reportedly because neither Himmler nor Hermann Göring attended. The conspiracy's political and military planning centered on Operation Valkyrie, originally a legitimate contingency plan for the Reserve Army to maintain order in Germany in case of civil unrest or uprising by the millions of foreign forced laborers working in German factories. The conspirators modified these plans to enable the Reserve Army to seize control of the government after the dictator's death. Major General Henning von Treschow played a key role in developing these plans while serving on the Eastern Front. General Friedrich Olbricht, as head of the General Army Office, had authority over the Reserve Army and access to the Valkyrie plans. The conspiracy included both military officers and civilians. Karl Friedrich Goerdeler, former mayor of Leipzig, served as a coordinator among civilian resistance members, and was designated to become chancellor in a post-Hitler government. Field Marshal Erwin von Witzleben, who had commanded German forces in France, was designated to become commander-in-chief of the Wehrmacht. General Ludwig Beck would become head of state. Ulrich von Hassel, former German ambassador to Italy, participated in planning and was considered for a role in foreign affairs. The Kreisau Circle, a group named after the estate of Count Helmuth James von Moltke, brought together intellectuals, aristocrats, social democrats, and church figures to discuss principles for Germany's reconstruction after the war. On the morning of July 20th, Stauffenberg and his adjutant, Lieutenant Werner von Haeften, departed Berlin for Rangsdorf Airfield. Stauffenberg carried a briefcase containing approximately 2 kilograms of British-made plastic explosives. The explosive was Composition C, also known as Nobel 808, obtained through resistance contacts in the Abwehr. The briefcase also contained a pencil detonator, a British-made acid-activated timing device that required approximately 10 minutes to trigger the explosion after activation. The Heinkel He 111 aircraft departed Rangsdorf at approximately 7 a.m. The flight to Rastenburg in East Prussia took approximately 3 hours. The aircraft landed at Rastenburg Airfield around 10:30 a.m. Stauffenberg and Haeften were met by a staff car that transported them to the Wolfschanze compound, arriving around 11:30 a.m. The Wolfschanze, or Wolf's Lair, served as the Führer's eastern military headquarters from June 1941 until November 1944. The compound occupied approximately 6 square kilometers of forest near the town of Rastenburg, in what was then East Prussia. It consisted of multiple security zones with checkpoints, bunkers built with reinforced concrete walls up to 8 meters thick, anti-aircraft installations, and barracks for military personnel and support staff. The Nazi leader spent most of his time from June 1941 to November 1944 at the Wolfschanze, directing military operations on the Eastern Front. Upon arrival at the Wolfschanze, Stauffenberg attended a briefing with Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, Chief of the Armed Forces High Command. During this briefing, Stauffenberg learned that the main conference scheduled for 1 p.m. had been moved up to 12:30 p.m. due to a visit Benito Mussolini was making to the Wolfschanze that afternoon. Stauffenberg also learned that the conference location had been changed from the underground concrete bunker to the Lagerbaracke, a wooden conference building above ground. This change significantly reduced the potential effectiveness of the bomb, as the open windows and wooden construction would allow much of the blast pressure to dissipate, rather than being contained as it would be in the concrete bunker. Shortly before 12:30 p.m., Stauffenberg requested permission to wash and change his shirt before the conference. He and Haeften were directed to a washroom where they could activate the bomb's detonator. With Stauffenberg's limited use of his left hand, Haeften assisted in breaking the acid capsule that would eat through a wire and trigger the detonation. They had prepared 2 bomb packages, but due to time constraints and an interruption when they were told to hurry, they activated only 1 package. The second package remained in Haeften's briefcase. The conference began at 12:30 p.m. in the Lagerbaracke. The building was approximately 15 meters long and 6 meters wide, constructed of wood with large windows on both sides to provide ventilation during summer months. Inside, a large oak map table dominated the room. The table measured approximately 5 meters long and 1.5 meters wide, supported by 2 thick oak supports. Approximately 24 officers attended the conference. The Führer stood at the center of the table, examining maps showing the deteriorating situation on the Eastern Front. Lieutenant General Adolf Heusinger, Chief of Operations, was presenting the daily situation report. Other attendees included Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, General Alfred Jodl, Vice Admiral Karl Jesko von Puttkamer. Rear Admiral Hans-Erich Voss, SS-Gruppenführer Hermann Fegelein, Colonel Heinz Brandt, Major Herbert Büchs, Lieutenant Colonel Heinz Weizenegger, and others. Stauffenberg entered the conference room carrying his briefcase. He positioned himself near the German leader, approximately 2 meters away on the right side. He placed the briefcase under the table near that position and against one of the heavy oak table supports. After a few minutes, Stauffenberg quietly left the conference room, telling an aide he needed to make an urgent telephone call to Berlin. He exited the building and walked to where Heften was waiting with a staff car, engine running. After Stauffenberg departed, Colonel Heinz Brandt, who was standing near the Führer examining the maps, found the briefcase obstructing his position. He reached down and moved the briefcase to the opposite side of the heavy oak table support, placing it approximately 2 meters from where Stauffenberg had left it, and positioning the thick oak support between the explosive and the Nazi leader. This action, taking only seconds, significantly reduced the blast's effect on the target. At 12:42 hours, p.m., the bomb detonated. The explosion completely destroyed the Lagerbaracke, blowing out all windows, collapsing the roof, and scattering debris across the compound. 4 men died from the blast. Lieutenant Colonel Heinz Brandt, who succumbed to his injuries later that day. Major General Rudolf Schmundt, the chief adjutant, who died on October 1st. First from his injuries, General Günther Korten, chief of the Luftwaffe General Staff, who died shortly after the blast, and stenographer Heinrich Berger, who died from his injuries. The intended target survived with relatively minor injuries. The heavy oak table support absorbed much of the blast directed toward him. His position, leaning over the table to examine maps, meant his body was partially shielded by the table itself. The open windows allowed much of the blast pressure to escape rather than being contained. His trousers were shredded by wooden splinters, and he sustained burns and cuts on his hands and face. Both eardrums were damaged by the blast pressure. His right arm was temporarily paralyzed, though function returned within several days. Stauffenberg and Heften, having heard and seen the explosion as they drove away from the conference area, passed through the outer security checkpoints during the confusion following the blast. At one checkpoint, a telephone call had been received about the explosion, but the guards allowed Stauffenberg to pass after he showed his authorization papers and claimed he was departing with Field Marshal Keitel's knowledge. The 2 officers reached Rastenburg Airfield and boarded the aircraft for the return flight to Berlin. During the flight back to Berlin, Stauffenberg was convinced the assassination had succeeded. The magnitude of the explosion and the complete destruction of the wooden building made it seem impossible that anyone inside could have survived. He could not have known that the target had been shielded by the oak table, or that the briefcase had been moved. The survival became known within 30 minutes of the explosion. Telephone communications from the Wolfschanze began reporting that the German leader was alive and had been injured but not seriously. By 1 p.m., he had been examined by his personal physician, Dr. Theodor Morell, and several other doctors. His injuries were treated, and he was able to walk and function normally, though his hearing was impaired. The investigation into who was responsible began immediately. SS security officers sealed the Wolfschanze and began interrogating everyone present. The destroyed briefcase was recovered from the wreckage. Witnesses reported that Stauffenberg had been carrying a briefcase and had left the conference room shortly before the explosion. By early afternoon, Stauffenberg had been identified as the primary suspect. Orders were issued for his arrest. Stauffenberg's aircraft landed at Rangsdorf Airfield at approximately 3:30 p.m. He immediately telephoned the Bendler Block, the Reserve Army headquarters in central Berlin, and informed General Friedrich Olbricht that the assassination had succeeded. Stauffenberg then drove to the Bendler Block, arriving around 4:30 p.m. He met with Ulbricht and other conspirators, insisting that the Führer was dead and that Operation Valkyrie should proceed immediately. General Friedrich Fromm, commanding general of the Reserve Army, refused to authorize Operation Valkyrie without confirmation of death. Fromm had been aware of resistance discussions but had not committed himself to the conspiracy. When he received telephone calls from the Wolfschanze confirming survival, he confronted Stauffenberg and demanded his arrest. The conspirators instead arrested Fromm and confined him to an office in the Bendler block. With Fromm under arrest, Ulbricht and Stauffenberg began issuing orders for Operation Valkyrie to proceed. Messages were sent to military commands throughout Germany and occupied territories instructing them to arrest SS and Gestapo personnel, secure government buildings, and take control of communications facilities. These orders were issued in Fromm's name without his authorization. The response to Operation Valkyrie orders varied by location. In Paris, the military governor, Karl Heinrich von Stülpnagel, who was involved in the conspiracy, ordered the arrest of SS and Gestapo personnel in Paris. Approximately 1,200 SS and Gestapo members were arrested during the evening of July 20th. In Vienna, some military units began moving to arrest SS personnel, but stopped when news of survival became clear. In Berlin, Major Otto Ernst Remer, commanding the Großdeutschland Guard Battalion, received orders to secure the government quarter. Remer, uncertain about the situation, was connected by telephone to the Führer himself. He was promoted to colonel on the spot and ordered to suppress the coup attempt. By 8 p.m., it had become clear that the coup was failing. Communications from the Wolfschanze confirmed survival. Military commanders throughout Germany, once they learned the Nazi leader was alive, refused to follow the Valkyrie orders. Some officers at the Bendler block began distancing themselves from the conspiracy. General Fromm was released from confinement by officers seeking to demonstrate their loyalty. Fromm, knowing he would face questions about his prior knowledge of the conspiracy, moved quickly to eliminate the main conspirators and any witnesses to his own suspicious inaction. He convened an immediate court-martial in his office. Stauffenberg, Ulbricht, Heften, and Colonel Albrecht Merz von Quirnheim were charged with high treason. The proceedings lasted less than an hour. No defense was permitted. Fromm pronounced death sentences on all 4 officers. The executions took place in the courtyard of the Bendler block shortly after midnight on July 21st. The 4 officers were shot by firing squad. Stauffenberg reportedly shouted, "Long live sacred Germany," before being shot. General Ludwig Beck, who had been present at the Bendler block during the coup attempt, was permitted to attempt suicide. He shot himself, but succeeded only in wounding himself. A second shot also failed to kill him. A sergeant was ordered to finish the task with a shot to the back of Beck's head. At 1 a.m. on July 21st, the German leader made a radio broadcast to the German nation. His voice, though showing signs of strain, was clearly recognizable. He announced that he had survived an assassination attempt by a small clique of ambitious officers. He stated that the conspiracy was limited in scope and would be completely eliminated. This broadcast effectively ended any remaining possibility of the coup succeeding, as it confirmed to all military commanders that the Führer remained in command. Heinrich Himmler was given extraordinary powers to investigate the conspiracy. All borders were sealed. Military officers above the rank of major were prohibited from leaving Germany without special authorization. Telephone communications were monitored. Mail was inspected. Anyone whose name appeared in documents seized from the conspirators or who was mentioned during interrogations was subject to arrest. The Gestapo established its investigation headquarters in Berlin. Teams of investigators were dispatched to conduct arrests throughout Germany and occupied territories. The initial focus was on officers who had direct contact with Stauffenberg or who had been mentioned in documents found at the Bendler block. Within days, the investigation expanded to include anyone who had ever expressed doubts about Germany's military situation or the dictator's leadership. Field Marshal Erwin von Witzleben was arrested at his home on July 21st. Documents found at the Bendler block identified him as the designated commander-in-chief of the Wehrmacht in the conspirators' planned government. General Erich Höppner, who had been dismissed from the Wehrmacht in January 1942 for retreating without orders during the Soviet winter offensive, had been present at the Bendler block during the coup attempt. He was arrested immediately. Höppner had come to the Bendler block on July 20th in civilian clothes, ready to assume command of the reserve army after the expected death. Karl Friedrich Goerdeler, designated to become chancellor in the conspirators' government, went into hiding when he learned the coup had failed. The Gestapo launched a massive manhunt. Goerdeler's photograph was distributed to every police station, border post, and checkpoint. A reward of 1 million Reichsmarks was offered for information leading to his capture. Goerdeler moved between safe houses in Berlin and nearby towns, attempting to reach neutral Switzerland. On August 12, 1944, he was recognized by an air raid warden at a small inn in Konradswald, East Prussia. He was arrested and transported to Berlin. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris was arrested on July 23rd. Canaris had been dismissed as head of the Abwehr in February 1944 after the organization fell under suspicion of harboring resistance members. He had been living in a form of house arrest at Burg Lauenstein in Bavaria. Documents discovered during the investigation revealed that Canaris had protected resistance members and had possessed knowledge of various plots. His arrest began months of interrogation. Initially, Canaris denied involvement in active resistance, claiming he had only been aware of discussions but had not participated in planning violent action. The principle of Sippenhaft, collective family responsibility, was applied systematically. Nina Schenk-Gräfin von Stauffenberg, Claus von Stauffenberg's wife, was arrested along with their 5 children. The children were placed in a children's home in Bad Saxe and given new names to obscure their identity. Nina was held in various prisons without trial throughout the remainder of the war. Similar treatment was applied to families of other conspirators. Wives, children, and sometimes more distant relatives faced arrest, property confiscation, and harassment. Fabian von Schlabrendorf, who had participated in the March 1943 Smolensk bomb attempt with Henning von Treschow, was arrested and subjected to severe interrogation. Despite harsh treatment, he provided minimal information to his interrogators. His case was complicated by the fact that evidence against him was based largely on his association with Treschow rather than direct participation in the July 20th plot. His trial was scheduled for February 1945, but was interrupted when Roland Freisler was killed during an Allied bombing raid. Julius Leber, a Social Democratic politician who had been imprisoned in concentration camps from 1933 to 1937 for his opposition to the Nazi regime, had joined resistance circles after his release. He met with Stauffenberg several times in June and July 1944 to discuss the role of Social Democrats in a post-Hitler government. Leber was arrested on July 5, 1944, 15 days before the assassination attempt. Despite being in Gestapo custody when the bomb exploded, he was charged with conspiracy based on his prior discussions with Stauffenberg. Ulrich von Hassel, former German ambassador to Italy, had been keeping detailed diaries documenting his opposition to Nazi policies and his discussions about peace negotiations with Western powers. When Gestapo officers searched his home, they discovered these diaries. The diaries provided extensive evidence of resistance discussions dating back years. Hassel was arrested in late July, and his diaries became important evidence used against multiple conspirators. The People's Court, presided over by Roland Freisler, conducted proceedings against the conspirators. Freisler had been appointed president of the People's Court in August 1942. He was known for his theatrical courtroom style, his denunciation of defendants, and his consistent imposition of death sentences. The Nazi leader ordered that conspiracy proceedings be filmed so he could view them personally. The first People's Court proceedings for July 20th conspirators began on August 7, 1944. 8 defendants were tried together: Field Marshal Erwin von Witzleben, General Erich Hübner, General Helmuth Stief, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Bernardus, Captain Friedrich Clausing, Peter Graf York von Wartenburg, and Ulrich Wilhelm Graf Schwerin von Schwanenfeld. The proceedings lasted approximately 8 hours. Defendants were deliberately humiliated. They were dressed in ill-fitting civilian clothes. Belts and suspenders were confiscated, forcing them to hold up their trousers with their hands. Field Marshal von Witzleben, who had held one of Germany's highest military ranks, appeared in an oversized jacket and trousers that constantly slipped down. This humiliation was intentional, designed to strip the defendants of dignity and authority before the cameras. Freisler conducted the proceedings with constant shouting and denunciation. He interrupted defendants when they attempted to speak, accused them of cowardice and treason, and made theatrical gestures for the cameras. Defense attorneys, who had been assigned by the court, made minimal efforts to defend their clients. The verdicts were predetermined. All 8 defendants were found guilty and sentenced to death. The sentences were carried out the same day at Plötzensee prison in Berlin. The method of execution ordered was deliberately designed to be prolonged and painful. Defendants were hanged from meat hooks using thin piano wire rather than traditional rope. The hooks were attached to the ceiling. The process took several minutes. The dictator reportedly watched films of these executions multiple times and showed them to visitors as demonstration of what happened to traitors. Carl Friedrich Goerdeler's proceedings before the People's Court began on September 7, 1944, but were repeatedly postponed. The Gestapo wanted to extract maximum information from Goerdeler about other resistance members before allowing his execution. Goerdeler was interrogated for months. Under pressure, and apparently hoping that cooperation might spare his family from Sippenhaft, he provided extensive information about civilian resistance networks. His cooperation led to dozens of additional arrests. He was finally sentenced to death in September, but the execution was delayed until February 2, 1945. General Friedrich Fromm was arrested in late July despite his execution of the immediate conspirators. Investigation revealed that Fromm had been informed of resistance discussions as early as 1943, but had not reported them. He had apparently attempted to position himself to benefit, regardless of whether the coup succeeded or failed. This calculated ambiguity was interpreted as complicity. Fromm was tried by the People's Court in March 1945, convicted, and executed by firing squad at Brandenburg Prison on March 19th. As a former senior Wehrmacht officer, he was permitted the military execution method rather than hanging. Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, commander of German forces in France, had been sympathetic to the resistance, though not directly involved in July 20th planning. When Stulpnagel in Paris ordered SS arrests on July 20th, Kluge initially supported the action, believing the Führer was dead. Once survival became known, Kluge attempted to distance himself from the conspiracy. On August 17th, while being recalled to Berlin to explain his actions, Kluge stopped his vehicle on a road near Metz and took cyanide. A letter found on his body urged an end to the war, but also claimed Kluge had remained loyal. Major General Henning von Tresckow, who had been instrumental in earlier assassination attempts and in developing Operation Valkyrie plans, was serving on the Eastern Front when the July 20th coup failed. Recognizing that his role would be discovered, Tresckow drove to the front lines on July 21st and deliberately walked into Soviet artillery fire. His death appeared to be a combat casualty, but fellow officers understood it was deliberate. A letter he left stated his belief that the assassination attempt had been morally necessary regardless of its failure. General Eduard Wagner, Quartermaster General of the Army and a resistance member, shot himself on July 23rd when he learned the Gestapo was coming to arrest him. General Fritz Lindemann shot himself on July 22nd. Treskov's suicide note stated, "The whole world will vilify us now, but I am still totally convinced that we did the right thing. Hitler is the archenemy not only of Germany, but of the world." Father Alfred Delp, a Jesuit priest who participated in the Kreisau Circle discussions, was arrested in late July. The Kreisau Circle had focused on intellectual and ethical questions about Germany's reconstruction rather than operational planning for assassination. However, the Gestapo made no distinction between those who had discussed alternatives and those who had actively planned violence. Delp was interrogated extensively about the Kreisau Circle's membership and discussions. He was tried by the People's Court in January 1945, convicted and executed on February 2, 1945. Count Helmuth James von Moltke, founder of the Kreisau Circle, had been in Gestapo custody since January 1944, arrested for warning a friend about impending Gestapo action. He could not have participated in the July 20th plot, as he was already imprisoned. Nevertheless, his documented opposition to Nazi policies and his leadership of discussion groups about post-Hitler Germany led to his trial and conviction. He was executed on January 23, 1945. The Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence organization, was dissolved in February 1944 after Admiral Canaris's dismissal. Its functions were absorbed by the Reich Security Main Office under Himmler's control. The July 20th conspiracy investigation revealed the extent to which Abwehr personnel had been involved in resistance activities. Colonel Hans Oster, Canaris's former deputy, had been dismissed in April 1943 and was living under house arrest when the coup occurred. He was arrested in late July 1944. Both Canaris and Oster were held for months, while the Gestapo gathered evidence from other prisoners and documents. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a Lutheran pastor and theologian, had been imprisoned since April 1943 for his resistance activities connected to the Abwehr. Bonhoeffer had used his church connections to maintain contacts with foreign church leaders, attempting to establish channels for peace negotiations. He had also helped Jews escape Germany. Documents discovered during the July 20th investigation revealed the extent of Bonhoeffer's opposition to the Nazi regime. Though he had not participated in planning the assassination, his documented resistance activities condemned him. By December 1944, the Gestapo had arrested approximately 7,000 people in connection with the July 20th conspiracy. Not all faced formal proceedings. Many were held indefinitely in concentration camps under protective custody. Some were released after interrogation but remained under surveillance. Others faced summary proceedings with minimal legal protection. Roland Freisler conducted People's Court proceedings almost continuously from August 1944 through February 1945. On February 3, 1945, during a proceeding, Allied bombers attacked Berlin. Air raid sirens sounded, but Freisler continued the proceeding. When bombs began falling nearby, people in the courthouse sought shelter. Freisler was struck by a falling beam and killed instantly. Files from the case he was hearing were found clutched in his hand. His death brought temporary relief to some defendants whose proceedings were postponed, but other judges continued the People's Court's work. In early April 1945, with Soviet forces approaching Berlin and American forces advancing from the west, orders came from Berlin to eliminate remaining high-profile conspiracy prisoners before liberation. Canaris, Oster, Bonhoeffer, Judge Advocate General Karl Sack, Captain Ludwig Gehre, and Theodor Strunk were transported to Flossenburg concentration camp in Bavaria. On April 8th, they underwent a brief summary proceeding conducted by an SS judge. On April 9th, they were executed by hanging. American forces liberated Stauffenberg on April 23rd, 14 days later. Fabian von Schlabrendorf, whose trial had been interrupted by Freisler's death, was moved between prisons as Allied forces advanced. He was eventually transported to South Tyrol, along with other prominent prisoners. He survived and was liberated by American forces in early May 1945. His survival was largely due to bureaucratic confusion and the chaos of Germany's final collapse, rather than any intentional mercy. Nina von Stauffenberg and her children survived the war in custody. They were held in various locations and eventually were moved to South Tyrol. American forces liberated them in May 1945. The children, who had been held under false names, were reunited with their mother. Nina von Stauffenberg lived until November 6, 2006, maintaining her husband's memory and participating in commemorations of the resistance. The exact number of people killed in connection with the July 20th conspiracy remains uncertain. Approximately 200 people were formally tried and executed. Several thousand more were arrested, and many died in concentration camps, during interrogation or by suicide. Conservative historical estimates place the total death toll at around 200 to 300 directly documented executions. Some historians suggest the total including all related deaths could reach 5,000 when including those who died in camps, during torture, by suicide, or as indirect consequences of the investigation. After Germany's surrender in May 1945, Allied forces discovered extensive documentation of the conspiracy and its suppression. The Gestapo and People's Court had maintained detailed records. Filmed proceedings were found in German archives. These materials provided comprehensive evidence of both the conspiracy and the brutal response it provoked. Post-war trials of Nazi officials included charges related to the persecution of July 20th conspirators. In the immediate post-war period, German public opinion about the conspirators was divided. Some viewed them as heroes who had tried to end the dictator's destructive rule. Others saw them as traitors who had violated their military oaths during wartime. This division reflected deeper questions about loyalty, obedience, and resistance to criminal orders. The Bendler Block building in Berlin, where Stauffenberg and the other immediate conspirators were executed, became a memorial site. The courtyard where the executions occurred was preserved. A plaque marks the location. The building now houses the German Resistance Memorial Center, a museum documenting resistance to the Nazi regime. Over subsequent decades, particularly in West Germany, the July 20th conspirators came to be honored as resistance heroes. Streets were named after them. Schools and military installations bear their names. July 20th is commemorated annually with ceremonies at the Bendler Block and other sites connected to the conspiracy. German military officers traditionally take their oaths of service at these commemorations, symbolically linking their commitment to democratic principles with the memory of those who resisted the dictatorship. The site of the Wolfschanze in modern-day Poland remains partly preserved as a historical site. Visitors can see the destroyed concrete bunkers and the location where the Lagerbaracke once stood. The conference building was not rebuilt after the explosion. The ruins remain as they were when the compound was abandoned in November 1944. Historical analysis of why the conspiracy failed focuses on several factors. The relocation of the conference from the concrete bunker to the wooden building significantly reduced the bomb's effectiveness. Colonel Brandt's innocent action of moving the briefcase placed additional distance and the heavy oak table support between the explosive and the target. The activation of only one bomb package, rather than both, reduced the explosive force. The open windows allowed blast pressure to escape, rather than being contained. Some historians argue The conspiracy was fundamentally flawed from the beginning. The conspirators failed to secure control of communications facilities before launching the coup. They did not have reliable allies in key positions throughout the military hierarchy. The plan depended on rapid action immediately after death, but delays and confusion allowed loyalists to organize resistance to the coup. The conspirators also failed to anticipate that military commanders would wait for confirmation before obeying Valkyrie orders. The question of whether the conspiracy could have succeeded if the assassination had worked remains subject to debate. Would the Wehrmacht have accepted a new government formed by the conspirators? Would the SS have surrendered power peacefully? Would the Western Allies have negotiated with a post-Hitler German government? Or would they have insisted on unconditional surrender regardless of who was in power? These questions remain unanswerable, but continue to generate historical discussion. The legacy of the July 20th conspiracy remains significant in modern Germany. The conspirators demonstrated that resistance existed within the German military and government. Their sacrifice is honored as an example of moral courage in the face of overwhelming power. The question they confronted remains relevant. At what point does loyalty to one's country require disobedience to one's government? When do military officers have not just a right, but a duty to resist criminal orders? These questions extend beyond historical interest and remain part of military ethics education in democratic societies. The conspiracy and its suppression also revealed the nature of totalitarian systems. The response to the assassination attempt was not limited to punishing those directly involved. The investigation expanded to eliminate anyone who had ever expressed doubt about leadership, anyone who had discussed alternatives, anyone whose loyalty could be questioned for any reason. This systematic elimination of potential opposition demonstrates how authoritarian regimes use threats to justify comprehensive suppression of dissent. The 5,000 arrests, hundreds of executions, and application of collective family guilt show the extent to which the Nazi regime was willing to destroy its own military leadership to maintain absolute control, even as Germany faced military catastrophe on all fronts. The international response to the July 20th plot varied significantly. In the Soviet Union, Stalin viewed the conspiracy with suspicion, seeing it as evidence that some German military leaders wanted to make peace with the Western Allies while continuing the war against the Soviet Union. The Soviet press gave limited coverage to the events. In Britain and the United States, initial reactions were mixed. Some viewed the conspirators as opportunists trying to save themselves as Germany faced defeat. Others recognized them as principled opponents who had risked everything. The British Broadcasting Corporation reported the assassination attempt and subsequent events, though details were limited due to wartime censorship and German control of information. The physical evidence from the explosion site provided forensic information about the bomb's construction and placement. Investigators found fragments of the briefcase, components of the detonator, and residue from the explosive. The damage pattern to the conference room showed that the bomb had been positioned under the table near where the target was standing. The blast had created a crater in the wooden floor. Windows were blown out in all directions. The roof structure had collapsed inward. These physical findings confirmed witness accounts about the briefcase's location and the explosion's force. Weather conditions on July 20th may have played a role in the conspiracy's failure. The warm summer weather led to the conference being moved from the concrete bunker to the wooden Lagerbaracke with its open windows. Had the weather been cooler or rainy, the conference would likely have remained in the bunker as originally planned. In the enclosed concrete space, the bomb's effectiveness would have been significantly greater. This factor, like Colonel Brandt's movement of the briefcase, represents one of several coincidental circumstances that contributed to survival. The psychological impact on surviving conspirators and their families was profound and long-lasting. Children who had been separated from their families and given false identities struggled with their experiences for decades after the war. Many faced difficulties in education and employment due to their family connections. Nina von Stauffenberg spent years after the war working to rehabilitate her husband's reputation and ensure that the conspirators were remembered as resistance heroes rather than traitors. She participated in numerous historical projects, gave interviews to researchers, and attended commemorative events until her death in 2006 at age 92. The medical treatment provided to the injured Führer was documented in detail by his personal physicians. Dr. Theodor Morell, who had been the dictator's personal physician since 1936, examined him immediately after the explosion. Additional doctors, including Professor Karl Brandt and Dr. Hans Karl von Hasselbach, were also present. They documented approximately 200 wood splinters removed from the Nazi leader's legs, burns on his hands and lower legs, damage to both eardrums, and contusions from the blast impact. The right arm paralysis was diagnosed as temporary nerve damage from the shockwave. Medical records show he received treatment for these injuries over several weeks. The forensic investigation of the explosion site was conducted by SS and police technical experts. They documented that the briefcase had contained approximately 1 kilogram of activated explosive, with another kilogram remaining unactivated. The pencil detonator mechanism was British-made, traced to supplies that had been smuggled into Germany through resistance networks. The investigators measured the blast crater, documented the destruction pattern, and collected fragments for analysis. These findings were used as evidence in subsequent proceedings against the conspirators. The diplomatic implications of the assassination attempt extended beyond Germany's borders. Neutral countries, including Sweden, Switzerland, and Turkey, received reports of the failed coup through their diplomatic channels. The attempted assassination raised questions about Germany's internal stability and whether the Wehrmacht might negotiate separately from the Nazi leadership. However, the swift suppression of the coup and the broadcast confirming survival eliminated any diplomatic openings the conspirators might have hoped to create. The role of communication technology in the coup's failure has been extensively analyzed by historians. The conspirators needed to control radio broadcasting and telephone exchanges to prevent loyalist forces from learning about survival. However, they failed to secure the main telephone exchange in Berlin or gain control of radio broadcasting facilities. This allowed the Wolfschanze to communicate directly with military commands throughout Germany, undermining the Valkyrie orders. Modern historical analysis suggests that even if the assassination had succeeded, the conspirators' failure to secure communications infrastructure would have complicated their ability to consolidate power. The economic costs of the conspiracy investigation were significant. Thousands of man-hours of military and police resources were devoted to tracking down, interrogating, and processing suspects at a time when Germany desperately needed those resources for the war effort. The removal of experienced military officers and administrators created gaps in the command structure that weakened Germany's ability to conduct effective military operations. Some historians argue that the purge of the officer corps following July 20th accelerated Germany's military collapse by eliminating competent commanders and creating an atmosphere of fear that paralyzed decision-making. If you found this historical account informative and want to learn more about World War II history, please consider subscribing to this channel. I research and document these historical events to preserve the memory of those who faced extraordinary circumstances. Your subscription helps me continue creating detailed, factual historical content. Thank you for watching.